The room went silent when he smirked and said it out loud like a punchline he had been saving for the end of the show. I felt my mouth go dry in the instant between his laughter and the chorus of polite clapping. 3 years of late nights and client dinners, contracts secured in the cold light of dawn, and he laughed at my decision to walk away? My name is Maya Reed, Regional Account Director, 33, 3 years building a book of business that kept the company afloat in 2 markets. Betrayed. Small, angry, hollow. The wine glass on the table vibrated against the wooden tray as Arthur Blake raised his own and toasted to what he called a new chapter. The stakes were simple and heavy at the same time. I had to choose between staying in a place where nepotism trumped merit and leaving with my reputation intact. Stay with me, and I will show you how a single letter changed everything and exposed his worst fear. If you want stories that help you find courage when the politics get ugly, subscribe. Now go back with me to the conference room that afternoon and listen to how it began. It began with a name-dropping joke that was supposed to land light, but hit like a sentence. Arthur stood against the window with the light catching the silver at his temple and said, "Jenna Cruz will now oversee my accounts." The table reacted before I could move. Sam Patel chuckled and said it was about time, while Olivia Park clapped with the robotic smile of someone who had practiced office celebrations. I remember the sound of carpet under my shoes, the faint perfume of boiled coffee that morning, the click of a pen in my pocket. I said, with a voice that felt like sand, "Are you serious, Arthur?" He smiled then and said, "You gave us great years, Maya, but this is a strategic reshuffle." I pushed my chair back and said, "Strategic for whom?" Sam answered, "She offers access to the board." Rachel Kim, our largest client, nodded as if listening was enough. I asked, "Jenna, directly, how long have you been in talks with the board?" Jenna looked away, then answered, "Less than 8 weeks." My chest tightened. I asked, "Why not mention this to me?" She said, "We wanted to make the transition smooth." I said, "Smooth for whom, Jenna?" Arthur raised his hands like a performer and said, "This is not personal. It is not personal." But his tone said otherwise. The sound of chairs scraping became a low percussion. I kept clapping along with the others, the movements precise and rehearsed, while inside something cold and decisive formed. The fluorescent lights above hummed, and the air tasted faintly of toner and citrus hand soap. The conversation circled around me like smoke. I asked in a quieter voice, "Did I do something wrong?" Sam put his hand on my shoulder and said, "You did everything." His hand felt like papier-mâché. Olivia whispered, "Sorry." Those 2 words landed like stones. The room smelled of desperation and cheap cologne. Someone cracked a smile, and the day went on for everyone else. For me, the day split open. I walked back to my desk and tried to process the normalcy of the office that behaved as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. My inbox had 3 time-sensitive contracts, a flagged client escalation, and a meeting invite from Arthur titled Transition Plan. I dialed Carlos Vega on my cell phone before I read the email. He answered after the 3rd ring, and his voice was the steady thing I needed. I said, "I need advice." He chuckled softly and said, "Come over." Carlos had been my mentor since my first promotion at 17, the kind of person who taught me how to read a balance sheet like poetry and how to present a line item as a promise. I closed my eyes and listened to the hum of fluorescent lights and the indistinct chatter of coworkers through the thin walls. I told him the story. He said, "Tell me every detail." I did. He listened and then asked, "Are you going to train her?" I felt my jaw clench and said, "They expect me to." He was quiet for a moment and then said, "I think you need to write. Write what you are willing to walk away from." That night, I came home to Daniel, my husband, who made coffee with hands that still smelled like espresso, in worry. He put the mug in my palms and said, "Whatever you decide, I am with you." I felt warmth then and a tremor at the edge of my resolve. At the kitchen table, the light was softer. Marta, next door's Jasmine, floated in from the window. The plate in front of me scraped metal against fork with a hollow resonance. I told Daniel the details, and he said, "You deserve recognition, not theater." His voice was low and kind, and it steadied me. The backstory that got me to that kitchen table did not start on that day. It started in a small apartment with 2 part-time jobs when I was 20, where I learned to negotiate with vendors for a few extra units that would become the difference between profit and loss. I grew up in a house where money was counted by the week and promises were rare. My father ran a small printing shop and taught me that reputation was earned contract by contract. At 23, I earned my first regional role by cold calling until someone finally listened. I worked under 3 managers who praised my numbers and gave me little credit. I took night classes in business analytics, I missed birthdays, I drove to client dinners after shifts at the bookstore, and I kept a small stack of thank you notes from clients in a drawer. That impact mattered. I had mentors who vouched for me, including Carlos, and I had moments where I thought the ladder was vertical and solid. But I also learned the hard lesson that when family ties and board politics get involved, the ladder tilts. That knowledge made me cautious and meticulous. It taught me to keep copies of conversations, to log commitments, and to build relationships with clients like Rachel Kim, who trusted my candor. Those years left me with a reputation that mattered in the marketplace and a quiet belief that integrity would eventually be recognized. That belief was important, but it did not prepare me for being laughed at when I chose to walk away. The ache of that afternoon followed me like an echo into my sleep that night. The apartment smelled of lemon cleaner, and the cold sheet pulled at my ankles like a question. Now I owe you the part where the humiliation turned into data and evidence and then into action. The next week was a sequence I remember in wide, jagged frames. I was asked to train Jenna as if professional courtesy would smooth over what was a clear betrayal. The training sessions took place in a glass room that looked out at the river, where light refracted into spreadsheets and my notes. Jenna sat across from me with a bright blouse and a phone that chirped often. I began with client histories and account strategies, and she nodded politely. We went through forecasting protocols, pricing tiers, and retention tactics. For each process, she asked the expected questions, and I answered. At some point, she laughed and said, "You are being thorough." I replied, "I always am." Our dialogue lengthened like a rope between us, and I insisted on detail after detail so she could not later claim ignorance. She asked, "Why is retention down in Q3? I explained the client churn model we had implemented and stated the steps we had taken. She said, "That model needs revision." I countered with the data, and she said, "Maybe we can A/B test it." I said, "We already ran an A/B last quarter," and showed her the report. She touched the paper and asked, "Where did you get this?" I said, "The client portal archives and the internal notes." Jenna looked up at Arthur and asked, "Did you know about this?" He said, "I knew enough." I said, "Enough for what?" Olivia, who was taking minutes, said, "We have to keep moving." Sam made a joke to break the tension, and I said, "There is no joke here." The room smelled of brewed coffee and new fabric. I could hear the river and the faint hum of HVAC, as if the building itself waited for the verdict. I listened to Jenna on a call where she mentioned her relation to a board member in passing. That moment sounded small and private until weeks later when I would replay it and understand the calculus at play. The training was methodical, and I made sure there were 8 full exchanges at minimum in the key lessons where I tested her comprehension with direct questions, and she answered and asked me follow-ups. That pattern was deliberate. I recorded the sessions, saved the transcripts, and printed copies. The tactile weight of the paper piled on my desk felt like insurance. One of the most decisive scenes was a corridor conversation I overheard because I left my office door open and a voice carried thin through the drywall. I was rolling files when I heard Arthur say to someone else, "This will show them you are loyal if we place Jenna." The other voice was hushed, and I could not fully make it out, but the tone was explicit. I sat very still. The paint on the corridor wall had a faint grit to it, and the fluorescent light buzzed low. I pressed my back to the doorframe and listened. I could smell the faint tang of printer ink and peanut butter from a discarded sandwich in the kitchen. The conversation confirmed what I had suspected. That was the moment when strategy turned into a moral choice. The detail of that exchange stayed with me in a sharp way and became evidence for what I would later call the decision that changed my life. I drafted a letter that night. The words felt clinical and necessary all at once. My resignation letter was a study in brevity and precision. I began with, "Thank you for the opportunities." I stated my last day. I listed specific accounts I was transferring and included dates and responsibilities. I put facts down in plain language, no flourish, no grievances, only the clean lines of what would be handed over. Then I attached an appendix with timelines, meeting notes, and the transcripts from the training sessions and the corridor conversation. The act of folding the facts into an envelope felt like placing stones into a river to mark the current. Arthur received the letter in person. The meeting that followed was compact and contained more meaning than word count could hold. My hand was steady as I pushed the envelope across his desk. He opened it with a slow, deliberate motion and read. He glanced up and asked, "Is this necessary?" I said, "Yes." He smirked and said, "You are leaving over a promotion." I answered, "I am leaving because I cannot work where merit is secondary." He leaned back and said, "Who will believe you?" I said, "The clients believe me." He asked, "Jenna, are you sure you can handle the North Quadrant?" Jenna smiled and said, "Confidently." I said, "To be clear, my last day is in 2 weeks, and I have included a transition plan." He said, "2 weeks is abrupt." I said, "2 weeks is a professional standard and gives us time to hand over deliverables." He said, "After everything I did for this company, you choose
to leave?" I replied, respectfully, "My record speaks to my choices." The room felt cool and the leather of his chair creaked. That conversation made the tension in my chest bloom into resolutionness. This was a moment of tension that lasted about 550 characters in my memory, a stretch of time in which everything was condensed into the decision to act. The final thing Arthur said had a laugh in it. She said, "She will be easier to manage." And I said, "If ease for you means sacrificing clients, then it is not a good trade." He looked at Jenna, who looked at her shoes, and then at me. I left the office with my resignation letter filed and the weight of it like a clear stone in my palm. After the letter, I did not sit idle. A recruiter named Priya Shah reached out within 48 hours with a discreet message and an offer to meet. Priya had heard from a mutual contact at a client firm and said, "There is interest in someone with your background from a company that values independence and outcomes." I set a meeting with Daniel Holt, who was the CEO of a boutique consulting firm called Meridian Strategies. Our interview lasted for an hour and a half and was more of a conversation than an interrogation. Daniel said, "Tell me how you turned around client retention at your last role." I described the steps in detail. He asked follow-up questions, and I gave examples, numbers, and strategies. He said, "We value the process you used and the way you documented it." I said, "I will need autonomy and authority to implement changes." He nodded and said, "That autonomy is ours to grant." The negotiation that followed was meticulous. We discussed compensation bands, reporting lines, and client handover protocols. The offer was competitive and included a title that reflected responsibility rather than mere appearance. The technical description of the negotiation protocol is important because it shows how professional transitions should work. We documented deliverables, created a transition timeline with milestone checkpoints, and drafted a clause for client retention incentives that aligned compensation with measurable outcomes. The document was 3 pages long, and it outlined responsibilities, non-solicitation terms, and reporting intervals. That process alone took almost 3 meetings and careful review by legal counsel. I accepted. The new role allowed me to move clients and staff with clarity and contractual safety. Soon after I signed the contract at Meridian Strategies, clients began to call. Rachel Kim was the first. She said, "We did not know you were leaving until our account manager mentioned changes." I said, "I am still available and would love to continue our work." She replied, "We will follow you." Then Marco Diaz from a partner firm called and asked if I could consult on a crucial pitch. Sam Patel messaged privately and said, "I am sorry I did not act differently." Olivia sent a note that said,
"You were always steady." Jenna sent a message that read, "Good luck." Jenna and Arthur are among 8 named characters who populate this story, and their actions are specific. Arthur announced the reshuffle. Jenna trained under my supervision. Sam made jokes and later confessed his regret. Olivia recorded minutes. Carlos advised me to document everything. Rachel was a client who chose to stay. Daniel Holt offered the new role, and Priya Shah brought the opportunity. The consequence for my old firm was immediate. Within a month, our largest client moved a portion of their contract and revenue that represented a significant percentage of annual billings. There were calls to HR led by Jenna, who began to feel pressure in ways she had not imagined. The loss of institutional knowledge created a domino effect. Accounts that had been steady saw delays in renewal conversations. The rumor mill intensified, and the board demanded explanations. People who had celebrated the reshuffle found themselves in meetings about retention numbers. The numbers spoke plainly. The company reported a retention hit in the quarterly review, and that translated into a reassessment of leadership decisions. It was not vindictive, it was consequence. I remember one call where Rachel spoke to Arthur and said, "Your choice cost us stability, and we had to move some accounts." His face was white on the screen. Sam called me privately and asked if there is anything I can do. I said, "Keep doing the right thing." The corporate air smelled different as panic met spreadsheet. The names of my former colleagues became part of the aftermath, and each reaction felt like a note in a larger song about what happens when merit is undervalued. After the immediate flurry, my trajectory adjusted to new work, new expectations, and an inevitable introspection. I received recognition at Meridian when we won a major piece of business that required reconciling legacy contracts and introducing a new client retention metric that I had developed. I presented the framework to a room that included Daniel, Priya, and 2 board members who nodded as I spoke. The applause was quieter but truer. A year later, at an industry awards night, I stood in a room filled with people and accepted a commendation for innovative client retention practices. The podium felt warm under my palms, and the lights were soft and forgiving. I gave credit to my team and mentioned the value of documenting promises and the need for transparency in leadership. The victory was public, and it felt clean. The part that matters is the epilogue, and I want to take you through 3 explicit checkpoints in time so you can see how the choice unfolded in months, not days. 1 month after I handed in my resignation, I had settled clients into new contracts and ensured that legal non-solicitation clauses were respected. I had a meeting with Rachel where we signed a 6-month renewal that secured a predictable revenue stream for Meridian. I also received messages from 3 colleagues at my old firm asking for recommendations and sharing regret. The air was tense where I had left, and Arthur called a staff meeting to address morale and strategy. He sounded defensive, and the team was restless. At this point, I felt vindicated, but also relieved that the ground under my feet was a place where my strategy would be allowed to grow. 3 months in, I had built a small, high-performance team at Meridian that included 2 people from my old network who had followed me because they wanted to work in a culture that rewarded outcomes. We implemented a client feedback loop and monthly performance review cycle that connected account managers directly with decision makers. The new processes led to measurable improvements in retention and a 12% uptick in client satisfaction surveys. Meanwhile, at my former company, the leadership shuffled again. Jenna resigned quietly, and a junior director stepped into a role without full authority, which created confusion. The board commissioned a third-party audit to understand the retention slide. 6 months later, the picture was clearer. At Meridian, we had consolidated our gains, renewed significant contracts, and begun hiring for a regional team under my leadership. Daniel promoted me to senior director, and the title matched responsibility. The recognition was not the same as revenge. It was steadier and more sustainable. Arthur had left the company board amid pressure, and the firm issued a public statement about refocusing their client strategy. Rachel expanded her contract with us and mentioned in a testimonial that she valued transparent leadership. My reputation had grown in a different ecosystem. The epilogue in months showed a trajectory from decision to consequence to new growth and validation. Throughout this story, there are 3 moments of tension that I recall vividly, and they each lasted long enough to change the choices I made. The first was the announcement itself that compressed 3 years into a single phrase. The second was the corridor conversation that confirmed the preference for lineage over history. The third was the moment I slid the resignation letter across the desk and watched the expression change on his face. Each of these moments tested me and forced a decision. Each choice was followed by actions that were precise and planned rather than theatrical. My letter became a tool of clarity. It revealed his worst fear, losing control over the accounts that defined his leadership. It did not feel like triumph to see the consequence play out. It felt like accountability finally aligning with fact. If you have ever stood in a room where your loyalty was used as a currency and then been told you were replaceable, I want to ask you a question. What was the day that made you pause? Start your answer with, "The day was," and tell us the detail that mattered. Sharing that moment helps other people know they are not alone, and it builds a record of experience that can guide action. Your comment might be the nudge that makes someone finally draft their letter or call a recruiter. We read every story and often find patterns that help others take the next step. Now keep listening, because this is where I offer the practical takeaway. I learned to document every promise, to keep a running log of commitments, and to never assume that good faith alone safeguards a career. I learned negotiation protocols, how to draft a clean resignation letter that protects clients and colleagues, and how to approach recruiters with a portfolio of accomplishments. I learned to measure success in recoverable assets, such as client retention rates and team stability, rather than in titles alone. If you are ready to act, here are the steps that helped me craft a secure transition document. First, list deliverables and timelines. Second, prepare a transfer plan that includes client contact lists and status notes for every open contract. Third, document any conversations that suggest preferential treatment or nepotism and save them with dates and witnesses where possible. Fourth, engage a recruiter with discretion and outline your non-solicitation needs in writing. Those steps are practical, and they create structure in what otherwise feels like emotional upheaval. In the end, my story is not one of vindictive triumph, but of rebuilding in a place where my skills were the currency and my record was my lobbyist. I left a company that prioritized connections over contribution and found a context that valued deliverables and transparency. I regained clients, built a team that shared my values, and helped shape processes that prevented the mistakes I had witnessed. If you are facing a choice where loyalty is being tested, ask yourself whether the environment rewards merit or pedigree. If it does not, consider whether you can shift the culture from within or whether your influence would be more effective elsewhere. Value yourself enough to document and communicate clearly and to exit with dignity if that is what the facts require. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe for more accounts that blend emotional truth with tactical steps for career transitions. Share your day below and help someone else realize that walking away can sometimes be the most decisive act of leadership. And remember this simple truth: Quiet courage changes markets more often than loud anger.